Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. It is my honor to moderate this wonderful panel of Flannery O'Connor scholars and experts. I know many of us in this room deeply admire and return to Flannery O'Connor over and over and over again. I'm going to, just to give a little bit of the format, I'll do some brief introductions, then we're going to watch a short clip of a trailer of a documentary by three of the panelists. Many of you might know it. And then we will shift to the questions, and how this will work is I will throw out two questions, not at once, individually, to the whole panel to respond. And then I will do a third round of questionings more tailored to the individual panelists' work. And then at that point, if the time permits, we'll go to Q&A from the audience. So without further ado, let me introduce our wonderful panel. So to my immediate left is Elizabeth Gahagan. She is at the University of Washington Rome Center. And then we have, as many of us know, Angela Alaimo O'Donnell at Fordham University. Then we have Fernanda Rossini. She is at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. Then to her left, right, yes, is Elizabeth Kaufman at Loyola University Chicago, then Ted Hardin, who's at Columbia University in Chicago, and then, of course, we all know Mark Bosco at Georgetown at the end. And just for those of you who are not familiar with this trailer, this is a documentary that Mark, Elizabeth, and Ted worked for 10 years on, about rough. They lost track of time, a long time, all right. And we're just going to watch a 2-minute trailer of it, and then we'll shift to the questions. Good. Enjoy.
One critic called her perhaps the most naturally gifted of American novelists, Flannery O'Connor.
A good man is hard to find.
Wise blood, mystery and manners.
Everything that rises must convict.
She's one of the best writers of the 20th century. I've read everything that she's written.
Flannery O'Connor is one of the writers least afraid to look at the darkness.
We've had an accident, the children screamed in a frenzy of delight. But nobody's killed, June Starr said with disappointment.
You think it's this bitter old alcoholic who's writing these really funny, dark stories. And then you find out she's a woman and that she's devoutly religious.
Flannery O'Connor was born in Savannah, Georgia, into an Irish Catholic community.
You get someone who's writing out of a specific time, specific set of manners. What she found was mystery.
I think that a serious fiction writer describes an action only in order to reveal a mystery.
How is she going to find the stories that she knows she needs to tell, and how is she going to tell them?
I do not want to be lonely all my life, but people only make us lonelier by reminding us of God. It's unbelievable.
She was so sick.
She never stopped writing.
It was the illness that made her the writer that she is.
I feel that the grotesque quality of my own work is intensified by the fact that I'm a Southern and a Catholic writer.
She's really funny. She's often funny in a very dire way.
She ignored the disapproval of her religion. She ignored the disapproval of her fiction.
She just saw the mystery of the craziness.
And if you haven't seen that film, I would highly recommend trying to watch it as soon as possible. It really is a wonderful overview of her life. But having said that, I would like to open up with one question for the entire panel, and this is not formal. This is more of a literary celebration than a formal academic session. So whenever we jump off, we stray from the question, feel free. But the first question I have for our panel is, from our various points of view, how or why is Flannery O'Connor relevant to both readers and creative writers today? And what does her Catholic faith have to do with this, if anything? And how would we each articulate this? I think that's like 3 questions, but.
Yeah, sounds good.
The people in this room are in the film that we have interviewed, and Angela was a very important part of the film. So thank you to everyone. You saw Alice up there. Randy was in the film, and Angela helped, Mike Murphy helped make this film happen, as we know it's very much a collaborative effort, so that's John, you were part of a lot of it too. You saw us.
And it was a real pleasure to work on the film and to see genius at work, which is what this team is, the absolute genius. And it was really, we've also been lucky, many of us, to see the film come into being. We've seen various incarnations of it over the years, and what they have distilled it down to is really beautiful, beautiful work. So if you haven't seen it yet, please treat yourself and take a look at the film. I made a couple of notes for myself at 2:30 this morning when I wasn't sleeping, so I'll just go ahead and respond to Brett's question. What strikes me, well, first of all, why do we read O'Connor? Because she's great. She is such a careful craftsperson. She's so brilliant. Her stories have the thumbprint of genius. You know an O'Connor story when you encounter one. There's just nothing else like it. So she obviously, this is her vocation to be a writer. This is what God meant her to do, and she pursues that vocation with abandon. In terms of what I feel is, she's Catholic in so many ways, but the thing that I always keep coming back to is that O'Connor is radically incarnational in terms of her attitude towards the world. Her worldview is one that's radically incarnational. Her characters are embedded in the particular, or in William Lynch's terms, whom we were talking about the very first day, in the definite. And so these are stories that are of a particular time and place. They're the American South in the mid-20th century, for the most part rural, or the rural South. There are some exceptions, of course. Some of the stories take place in New York City, etc. But for the most part, it's Flannery's world. And there's something about the, and we know what to expect from O'Connor. There is a sense of the world being a beautiful, blessed place loved by God. The world is charged with the grandeur of God, but it is also the site of evil. The devil holds a lot of the territories. And so characters who are living in this beautiful but very imperfect world inevitably are afflicted by sin, inevitably afflicted by brokenness, and they're very much in need of grace. And O'Connor's characters in the course of her story is always encounter the opportunity, at least, for grace, usually through some sort of violent event that erupts in their lives, and they're given a chance, at least, to see themselves for who they really are. And that's just such a powerful story, because it's all of our stories, right? We're all, if we have a Catholic worldview, we understand we come into the world with original sin. We all tend towards sin, and we're all very much in need of grace and in need of the mercy of God. And yet at the same time, as she says, even the mercy of the Lord burns. And so these are not easy revelations. These are not easy conversions. Conversion, as O'Connor says, is a blast of annihilating light that lasts a lifetime. And so we see a character turn towards conversion, but they're going to be doing that for the rest of their lives, basically. So these are the kind of Catholic elements that are so deeply part of O'Connor's way of seeing the world that we see showing up in the stories again and again. And they ring so true for those of us who also have this Catholic worldview.
I would just say that I know this is sound presumptuous, but after Dante, it's Flannery O'Connor. I mean, there's just nobody who can be so in the concrete, but give a universal kind of feeling, a universal insight. So I agree, it's very much about the concrete. She's important because she has mastered the parable in a new form called the short story, and parables last forever. And we're still looking at the prodigal son, and we're still reading Revelation by Flannery O'Connor. Not that they're the same, but there is a sense that I think that O'Connor's Catholicity comes really out in the way that a parable upends our life, our reality, and brings us back down to earth and to the earth, to say, who am I? Who am I before God? Who am I before myself?
After hearing and listening to Pope Francis today, some of the comments that I wrote down at 4 a.m. don't quite ring the same, but let me start. I had a quote from that great filmmaker, Catholic filmmaker, Jesuit-educated Alfred Hitchcock, who said, "I'm a writer and therefore automatically a suspicious character." And I thought, no, that's perfect for Flannery O'Connor, thinking about suspicious characters. And when you operate as a documentarian or a journalist in the nonfiction mode, you need to be sort of suspicious of the truth and of the stories that people are telling you, and you want to always sort of check out, reconfirm what they're saying to you, and dig a little deeper. Again, after the wonderful lecture talk from Pope Francis, I want to think about what we can say about the Catholic imagination today in terms of Flannery O'Connor, and how we can say it from the perspective of a suspicious character. And I immediately went to thinking about the United States today and Georgetown. And how wonderful it is that Georgetown is pushing on the history of slavery with the institution, and really pushing on teaching both that history and offering some reparations for that history. I think the church has also really pushed around the sexual abuse scandals and the suspicion around that, and the pain and suffering around that. These are all, in my mind, very Flannery O'Connor ways and Dante-esque ways of pushing through the darkness to get to a place of redemption. After George Floyd and some accusations against Flannery O'Connor of use of inappropriate language and some racism, that got sort of the Flannery team here to go back and re-review letters and postcards and again sort of reconfirm what our initial instincts had been with her storytelling and how we felt about it. For instance, we dug up, I got a copy from Emory of the postcard that she had written when she was 18 or 19 and first went to New York on a train and wrote Regina, her mother, a postcard in her notoriously politically incorrect fashion about the colored brethren on the train was a phrase she used, and then she also called out the Jews. And she said, the end of the train ride, I wanted to get off and take a bath. So she wrote that when she was 18, and this is before Iowa. Well, 3-4 years later, she's gone through the Iowa workshop, and she just wrote The Geranium. She wrote a short story. This is, I don't know how many of you have read her thesis, but The Geranium, which became Judgment Day. She was writing and thinking about a displaced older white man in New York City who uses racist language and has an African-American neighbor who he's negative about, but then he starts to fall down the stairs, and that black neighbor is the one who catches him. So that's within the short span of just a few years. And for me, with my own suspicious character about, okay, let's really dig down with some of this inappropriate use of language that O'Connor has done occasionally, and then see how she had transformed through graduate school within a few years and was writing some of the revelatory fiction that we all sort of know and love. That for me was an important part of this process of making the film, and of how we teach it, how we teach about that process of being both suspicious as well as finding revelation. All right, got Hitchcock in there.
Anyone else would like to say anything or go on to the next one?
I'll say something brief, since I feel like I'm being set up in terms of shooting this documentary, but also coming into the merging sort of the O'Connor consciousness, if if that's a thing, it feels like it is, with filmmaking. And Pope Francis gave us that wonderful couplet, in a way, of the eye from the flesh, but also the mirror eye, and this both, the glass eye, the both and. That's super important because photography and time-based filmmaking is often reductive in how it captures the world. So we know from the great films that we've seen that one can bear witness with mystery in mind through composition and so forth. But it does have to have that kind of dreaming sensibility factored in, and it's a humble sense of dreaming in the affording sort of mystery to be part of the image design, but also sound design, all of these sort of cinematic storytelling designs. We try to teach to that. We fail every day at it, and that Connor's writing is so powerful in its economy, and that is the hardest thing to get emerging filmmakers to get to. So you have to basically, the O'Connor school would be, you have to fail a lot and revise a lot, right? Yeah. Which means you have to bear witness a lot and try to speak to that and stumble and fail. And that we're not comfortable with discomfort these days, right? We have more of a fixed eye towards perfectionism. So there's this conundrum of how do you get to something that has mystery baked into it when you have a camera with a lens or a microphone. And so it was a great joy to try to come into that sensibility. I mean, we've been making documentaries for a while, but to really bring it to bear on everything. So interviews can't be overlit, every shot. And eventually, I think there's another question we can talk about, the embodiment of how does one bear witness with these tools in mind. That's also interesting to think about, but it's really important. And as I can just attest to, as one is trying to do this with these tools, it does feel like an act of faith in a way, right? And yeah, we'll continue.
Okay. I just wanted to add a little bit about the idea of the Catholic imagination in terms of teaching young writers, and in my fiction workshop, going off a little bit of what you said about the eye. And Flannery O'Connor has this quote about that for the writer of fiction, the testing point is always in the eye. And I happen to teach creative writing in Rome. So the students I work with come to Rome oftentimes because they think, or from what they tell me, they think it's going to bring them closer to their faith. And a lot of times the complexities of the city of Rome and living sort of in the shadow of the Vatican does quite the opposite. And so when I talk to other teachers of creative writing, my colleagues in the States, they always say that their students never write anything about faith or spiritual path. And I find it's quite the opposite. So I think it's something to do with the combination of me teaching them Flannery O'Connor, and yes, of course, she's a master of the craft in terms of her precision and her you know, her structure and her, you know, obviously perfect third-person narrative. But it's not that they learn from, I don't think. I think it's the fact that she believes in the mystery of it, and that gives them license to come back to what they see and to report it without being too politically correct, because these are young people who have grown up with nothing but political correctness. So I feel like O'Connor is really important for young writers to read, not because of all the obvious reasons that she's always taught in creative writing workshops, but exactly because of her Catholic imagination and the underpinning in her stories that is heavily tied to that.
I'm Italian, and I'm presenting Flannery O'Connor. So, okay, I'm Italian. I'm not in the academic world. I wrote biography of Flannery O'Connor, and that's why I'm here. And I'm just, I have nothing to add to what they have already said, because I'm not so inside and I haven't studied so deep Flannery O'Connor as they have. But I wanted to present Flannery O'Connor from the Italian point of view. And from this point of view, I have to say, outside the academic world, I have to say that she's almost unknown to the general public, because there are problems with the translation. Usually when people read Flannery O'Connor, they notice that not the faith and the deepest thought of Flannery O'Connor, but they have a problem with the, how do you say, with the difference, the discrepancy between her Southern culture and our Catholic culture, which are very different and bewilders the reader who are not so convinced and so deep in Flannery O'Connor thought. And I think that the biography I wrote, where I tried to intertwine the academic aspects of Flannery O'Connor and the aspects of her life and thought, will help to know Flannery O'Connor in the to the general public. I want her to be known outside the academic world, which is very important, but I want her to become a known writer in the general, how do you say, in the general public, for the general readers. So what I have noticed, however, is that since her arrival in Italy, more or less in the 60s, she has been sometimes translated, sometimes forgotten, sometimes rediscovered, but she has never stopped to be published and to be printed. So I think that in some way she is still present in our literature, even if she's not so known outside the general, the academic. Oh, sorry, I'm not used to speaking English. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that. We'll follow up on some of those themes later, but for now, just another question for the entire panel. Each of us has focused, or each of you, I should say, each of you has focused on at least one of the various discourses surrounding Flannery O'Connor, theologically, narratively, historically, as biographers, as documentarians, as creative writers, and so forth. What have you learned about the craft of fiction, as well as the Catholic imagination, by reading, writing, and studying her today?
I would just say that Flannery O'Connor doesn't just have a Catholic imagination, she's a Catholic theological imagination. So that was why I keep on saying she's like Dante. She really understands theology. I quoted William Lynch. She read William Lynch. A lot of the people that were part of that renaissance of Catholic thought in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, she was just eating it up and figuring out a way to make it part of the drama. So I teach a seminar almost every other year at Georgetown, and I get about anywhere from 15 to 20 students. And there is a sense that reading all of her work, and they do, this is what I love about Georgetown students, they read everything you give them. It's just like, oh, okay. So we're reading the letters, and there's a change in them, in the student. The change from reading 6 stories, then go to the letters. They figured out, they got the key finally by the 6th short story of, they kind of figure out how they're going to work their way into the meaning, as Flannery O'Connor was always judging. But then they read the letters and they feel like they've met someone holy almost, or at least someone authentic. And that life becomes kind of like a companion through the course. And so Flannery O'Connor, by the last 6 weeks of the course, is a very different kind of conversation. It's even more relaxed in some ways. And people are like ready for it. Like, okay, we're going to get ready for it. So I would suggest that the whole person is there in her writing in different ways. Very human, very much on a journey. And she almost like continues to invite you into her life.
please.
Well, I was going to add that, you know, working on this film with Mark, which Mark brought to me and asked me to help with, was such a joy. And, you know, my response to your question in part has to do with, because I'm not Catholic, I was raised Presbyterian, and so I came to Flannery O'Connor.
This close to
I know, we're putting bets. One of my sisters has converted already, so we're putting bets down on how long. After this conference, I don't know, maybe closer. But I always approached the story, and we both had the sense of, we wanted it on PBS, right? We didn't want it to be, you know, obviously the Catholic theology is leading the way, and that's the audience. You know, I was always sort of from an interfaith perspective or a secular perspective. I wanted it on PBS, and darn it, we got it on PBS without, I think and hope, sacrificing her Catholic imagination, and which she would have wanted there, right? And I understood that by reading her letters, and her commitment and her devout faith was, for me, from a Protestant perspective, inspirational. Her commitment to her Catholic faith, and I wanted our film to very much to carry that across for the broader audience. So how we did that, and how Ted's great photography and the sound design, and how we tried to embody, you know, what was she seeing when she woke up? What's the sound of her cane? Oh, we hear the peacocks outside. You know, how you build a world and then try to fill it with that Catholic imagination. That's what took us 10 years.
And just to add to I feel like we're reliving how we constructed the film for this long time, because we kept conversing and sort of ideating on what to include. Some of the scenes from the short stories are animated, of course. And you know, we were hungry for more. It was quite interesting. But I was going to say earlier, from the two different kinds of eyes that we heard about today, in documentary practice and theory, it's referred to as the mirror and the hammer. So documentaries are known for trying to pursue, the definition is basically trying to, a corner of an actuality as seen through a human sentiment. And so that kind of corner that one witnesses, yes, one could mirror it and bear witness. However, and this is what Flannery teaches wonderfully, which is you need to push on it, because the superficial side of what you're witnessing is not the whole story, obviously, or it's even disguised as the whole story. And so Flannery always pulls back those layers through either character or these brilliant plot points or amazing starting points. One of my favorite short stories, Late Encounter with the Enemy, it departs a little bit from her strict reporting of the external world, the actualities that a lot of us can see, and it goes internal to this troubled mind and history and memory of a very problematic character, which has also really happened with Gone with the Wind when it was rolled out, having these Civil War veterans hauled up on stage. I mean, the footage, that alone is, anyway. But that gesture in that story, but many, many other writings, and her writings, her letters are also evidence of this, is there's something beyond that surface. And we talked about Schopenhauer, we talked about I mean, she was so well-read and committed, and probably later well-read than maybe some other, or wasn't surrounded by other people who were well-read early, and so it's even more just a great lesson for the expansive side of how when one's willing and open and to the power of the imagination, and she fills it in beautifully. But she leaves room for us to fill in more. Like the work is not complete until it's read, right? And that's why I think your comment about Dante, it's great. it's appropriate because there's something that's completed when you encounter Flannery O'Connor.
So I'm going to throw a rock in the pond. We've been talking for days now about the expansiveness of the Catholic imagination and the way in which, in O'Connor's terms, it allows her to find the intersection of time with eternity. And that's really what every writer is trying to do. And she does that beautifully over and over again in her stories. But a couple of years ago, I wrote a book called Radical Ambivalence, Race in Flannery O'Connor. And I've been teaching O'Connor for 40 years, reading and teaching O'Connor for 40 years, and it's very interesting to me. My students respond very differently to O'Connor now than they did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And so I just started with the question of, so what is going on in these stories that maybe I'm not seeing because I've gotten used to seeing them through a particular lens, and I want to see them afresh. And so I went to the archives, I read letters that had not been released and still have not been released. The family kind of didn't want Sally Fitzgerald to publish some of them because O'Connor says some troubling things about race. Elizabeth alluded to one of the postcards, that she wrote as a young woman. And so it was very interesting to me that personally there are signs in the letters that O'Connor was someone who was on the road towards a fuller understanding of the relationship between the races in her native South, which of course is Jim Crow South, and it's still recovering from slavery. It still is now, let alone in the 1950s and 1960s when she was alive. And it was very interesting to me because then one of the directions that my research took me was, so what was the church like? What sorts of models did O'Connor have for thinking in what we think of as progressive ways about race? And the church was not a lot of help. It was a white church and it was a slow church. So like in 1958, the bishops released a statement. It took them until 1958 to release a statement that said, you know what, we really shouldn't be segregating our masses and our schools. That's really not okay because we're all equal in the sight of God, the Imago Dei, etc. Many priests in the South actually tried to integrate their schools and tried to integrate those churches, and white people would have no part of it. They would say, we'll just take the kids out of the school if that's what you're going to do. We're just not going to go to Mass here if that's what you're going to do. So basically, the priests just said, okay, we're not going to do that then. And the Catholic schools in the South didn't integrate until after the public schools did. So O'Connor never went to Mass with African Americans. She never received communion from the hands of an African American priest. She was never taught by African American nuns. They were all, from Ireland, the Sisters of Mercy. And so all of these examples that she had did not lead towards this sort of progressive vision that, all of us would have liked for O'Connor to have, but she didn't at the time of her death in 1964. 1 month after the 1964 Civil Rights Act was enacted or passed. So she dies like right on the cusp of all of this change going on. She died at 39, as most of us know, of lupus. She didn't get to live through the civil rights movement and have her mind gradually changed. We do know that she was, reading her friend Thomas Gossett, who was a professor at Mercer University. He wrote a book called Race, A History of an Idea, which is a groundbreaking book about the idea of race, the whole idea of it coming really from the colonial past, about slavery. And she writes a letter on her deathbed basically saying, I'm reading your book, Tom, it's really interesting. Who knows how far she got in it because she was quite sick when she was reading it. So she's obviously on this journey. We also know she's on this journey because of the stories she's writing. She writes Revelation, which is one of the most brilliant stories one can imagine in terms of unmasking white privilege, unmasking the soul-destroying sin of racism and what it is doing to her main character, Ruby Turpin, and why she needs a wake-up call to know that racism is evil, and it's something that she needs to heal in herself, or she's going to go to hell. As the character Mary Grace says to her, go back to hell where you came from, you old warthog. And she is on her, she came from hell and she's on her way to hell, except for this Grace, that Mary Grace, who comes into her life. So there's part of O'Connor's brain and heart and mind that knows, okay, it is terrible to be a racist and to have racist ideas and thoughts and language. And then there's the human part of O'Connor, which is raised in a deeply racist culture by a deeply racist mother, and it's like a toxin that you take in. And it's very hard to excrete that from your system entirely. And all of us who have been socialized as white people have inherited it too. We're not born that way, but it happens because of what we see in the world around us. Even if we have the most progressive parents, we see what's going on around us. And so one of the reasons I think O'Connor is a writer for our moment, people were trying to cancel her a couple of years ago after my book came out, and it wasn't just my book that caused the kind of sudden interest in O'Connor's race. But it was this idea that people want purity. We don't want a writer who maybe, yes, she has these racist tendencies, and yet at the same time she's writing these stories that are, the more contemporary term we use, are anti-race stories, right? She's doing anti-racist work. And so that's why my book is called Radical Ambivalence. Ambivalence coming from the Latin meaning both and. Can you feel at the same time two ways about a subject? Of course you can. We all know that that's the case. And so we see O'Connor having this sort of psychomachia that is working itself out in many of the stories, particularly in Revelation. And so it was very interesting to me to see that the church, which really should have been, could have been a help to her at the time, was not. And of course, as we know, particularly in America, we still are not all that welcoming, the Catholic Church, to African Americans or to people of color. It's just it's a journey that the church is still on. So it was very interesting to me that the thing that is the source of O'Connor's power, her Catholic imagination, has great resources and allows her to imagine herself and us into a very different kind of space other than the one that we're in, but then there are also limitations to it as well. And just one more thing that I'll say about that is O'Connor has the long view, the really long view. I love Josephine Jacobson, the Catholic poet, who says, Catholics are, as a Catholic, she says, I'm a short-term pessimist, but a long-term optimist. And that's O'Connor. So when she writes a story like Everything That Rises Must Converge, which we all know is a title that she takes from Teilhard de Chardin's book, The Divine Milieu. And Teilhard's vision and O'Connor's vision is that there's this gradual divinization that's happening, and God's making it happen. We're not making it happen. God is bringing this about, and the Perugia is eventually going to happen. And there's nothing we can do to make it happen. And so there is this kind of sense of, she thinks of civil rights, the civil rights movement, the desire to bring about a perfect society as kind of futile and F-U-T-I-L-E, not feudal, but futile, and sort of not really recognizing that the only way that this is going to happen is through God. So it's very interesting to me that this faith that she has and this long view, when she looks at social problems, us Americans, of course, we think we can fix everything. And she says, no, you really can't fix everything. You can't force people to stop being racist. The book was a revelation to me in terms of these forces that O'Connor was dealing with in terms of her own church, her own culture, which shaped her in a particular way. And I think her courage and her heroism in trying to write her way out of a particular way of thinking. And the stories are the proving ground where O'Connor is trying to wrestle with this very difficult problem of race. And so the stories, O'Connor comes off much better in her stories in some ways when it comes to this question of race than she does in her writing, her letters rather, her private correspondence. And I think it's Ralph Wood, the great O'Connor scholar, who says that there are two kinds of discourse that she's engaging in. the one that her stories are for the ages. The letters are just a letter to a friend, you know, that she dashes off and she sends it. That's not for the ages. The stories are the things that she worked, and she was trying her best, and her better angel always prevails in the stories, even if there are little elements that, of course, betray her you know, acculturation and socialization as white. So anyway, what interests me is this flawed O'Connor. And that's so much more interesting than a pure person, as far as I'm concerned. Well, I don't think a pure person exists. And she is all of us in many ways in trying to think through these problems.
I wanted to just talk for a second about, in terms of what I've learned about the craft of fiction and the Catholic imagination from reading Flannery O'Connor. From the point of view of a short story writer, I came to Flannery O'Connor very late, and it was, like most writers, I had read her, and most students of literature, I had read her, but it wasn't until probably about 10 years ago, during a conversation with Father Mark Bosco, that Flannery O'Connor sort of came back into my life. And it was just at a time when I was starting to write short stories myself. I had been working in longer forms and trying to do other things. And so I think I was lucky that that happened at that juncture, because I was also feeling, in terms of my own Catholic imagination, very distant from my own relationship to my Catholic upbringing and my own faith. And so diving into her helped give me space to sort of return to those ideas and a place to kind of operate from that was new. One of the things that O'Connor says is to know oneself is to know the world, and is paradoxically an exile from that world. And I think, having moved abroad and being American living in Rome, I felt a little bit distant from what I had grown up around, and I felt distant from my own sort of version of Catholicism, because Italians have a culturally different approach to Catholicism. And I mean, that's obviously another conversation, but going off of kind of what Fernanda had said, you know, I think there's an affinity in the Italian culture for Flannery O'Connor, just as there is an affinity for Fellini because of the grotesque. And both artists have this embedded Catholic imagination, right, in their work that's so clear to see. And it's something I've tried to write about in the past. But just for myself, I think O'Connor gave me permission in a way to really see my own writing as a spiritual journey. And that was a huge gift. So that was all I just wanted to add.
Thanks. So I'm a teacher in the primary school. Sorry. Okay. Power. Okay, thanks. I'm a teacher in a primary school. So when I first read the Flannery O'Connor stories in the early 90s, so it has been many years since I have been studying Flannery O'Connor and dealing with her, I was more profoundly attracted by the presence of child characters scattered throughout all her narratives. However, what really slapped me in the face, to use her word, was the death of 7 of them. The lives and deaths of these child characters have been haunting me to the point that they have become the subject of my doctoral thesis, in which I investigated their function and their role and the reason for their death from a especially Catholic perspective. Yes, all my researching not only enriched my knowledge of O'Connor, but helped me to grow to greatly appreciate her spiritual integrity and personal coherence. I fully realized, in a personal way, how her life, thought, and works are profoundly intertwined. Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay. I usually shout in my class, and then now I can't. Okay, right. So, in a personal way, I fully realized how her life, thought and works are profoundly intertwined and pervaded by her adamant Catholic faith. So what really struck me and is still perplexing me is the firmness of her faith, which in spite of her lifelong illness shines from the words I admire most, which are, I can, with an eye squinted, take it all as a blessing. Thank you.
Well, did you I want to follow up now with some questions that are a little more tailored to individual people. So Elizabeth, you actually alluded to this already. I'm just very curious, as somebody who's a creator of fiction yourself, how formative has O'Connor been in your creative work, particularly when you have to deal with a genre of short story, which is, of course, she was well known as a master for, and, or does a writer need to forget their favorite authors as much as possible when they create their own fiction?
Okay. Thanks, Brent. Well, as I said before, I came to O'Connor a bit late, and I think that was a gift for another reason, because as we all know, there's, Bloom's anxiety of influence, right? And so there are writers that we love that when we start to work on our own craft that we probably are copying to some degree, and we don't want to be derivative, right? So I was lucky in the sense of coming to O'Connor late, because I think my style or my voice was somewhat in place. So I could glean other things from what she had to offer me. So it wasn't so much about her as a sort of kind of would-be mentor in terms of the craft, but really about her her faith, I think, was what helped me begin to write and gave me courage to write unabashedly about despicable people, people who do unspeakable things. It was a sort of validation, I think, but I actually, when I was working on my Fellini and O'Connor paper for a conference that some of us, many of us were going to attend in Dublin, it was about the mystery of place. And I was thinking about the mystery of place in these two artists, right? But at the same time, I was also, this terrible crime had occurred near my house in Rome. And I kept thinking, what would O'Connor do with something like that? It was an infanticide. A young man threw his 2-year-old off the bridge by my house in Rome. And I used to ride my bike over that bridge every day, and it haunted me. It haunted me. And I read something in the correspondence between Caroline Gordon and Flannery O'Connor that just suddenly distilled an image that I had. And the way that O'Connor often, as people have mentioned, that grace is always sort of ushered in by violence in her stories. It sort of just crystallized for me, and instead of writing my Fellini paper, I spent the next 4 days writing a 45-page story that I kind of felt O'Connor had somewhat delivered to me, because it's a complete aberration in terms of the other things I've written, but also because it got me so much closer to a spiritual discourse, and it interestingly is the one story that most people ask me about. If they've read anything at all, which most people haven't, but they always ask me about that story. And when my book came out in Spanish, it was the single most, the story that must have stuck out to every Spanish reader, because they always ask me about it. I assumed because Spain is also a Catholic culture, right? And so it somehow struck a chord, but I mostly attribute it to my kind of, for 4 days, being as fearless as Flannery, and something I try to aim to do in future work. But anyway, I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah,
but
no,
yeah.
thank you for that.
Thanks.
I'd actually like to shift the conversation a little bit now to the global theme of the conference. And Mark, if I could start off the question for you. Fernanda already alluded to the fact that in Italy, for example, Flannery O'Connor is not really that well known relative to America. And I think for a lot of readers in other countries, if they hear the term Catholic writer, they might think of Graham Greene, if you're in Britain, or Shisako Endo if you're in Japan, or Mariak if you're in France. And I guess my question to you is and I know you're familiar with all of that, what do you think O'Connor, how is O'Connor unique from other famous Catholic writers in other countries?
I think Alice McDermott's here, and she said it so well. She said, there's just nobody like her. She's sui generis in that regard. Thank you, Alice. That made it into the film. But I do think, first of all, I think that O'Connor has the ability to transcend, and I'll go back to that, in a parable-like way, we can find ourselves in it. Secondly, she's loved by artists. When we did this film, we had no problem asking every writer to be part of this film. We didn't have to beg. Oh, we would love to. We all had to go. Actually, Tobias Wolff said we all had to go through our Flannery O'Connor moment, And so there was a sense that he once said to me that you have to go. You don't become Flannery O'Connor, but you have to go through her. You're going to learn a lot of things when you go through her. So there's a sense that she's always going to be global because every artist who engages her is going to have to, it's going to overwhelm them, and they're going to have to kind of tease out who they are in the midst of that, which is exactly what you were really talking about, Elizabeth. So that's the first, that would be one thing. She's so unique. She does, in that regard, I think, sit like Dante in a place where if you can get the language, the translation, she offers a lot. And thirdly, because she's so, because her stories really are these acts of redemption, are these gestures towards redemption, or these glimpses of redemption. I don't know, maybe I just read her too much, but I see them so hopeful always at the end. And I know that sounds weird if you've read a lot of Flannery O'Connor, but I find that's why. I think she's got a global kind of sensibility.
Well, continuing with that global theme, I want to throw out one question to all the four in the middle. How convenient of you to arrange yourself like that. And then after they muse that over a bit, we'll open up to Q&A the audience. But this is the question to Fernanda, Angela, Elizabeth, and Ted. Because you all worked with O'Connor in different mediums, but all in terms of her biography. And O'Connor once wrote that the best American fiction has always been regional, but this conference asked us to consider the global aesthetics of the Catholic imagination. So my question is, which makes me wonder, is how important is the readers outside the States, outside the United States or North America, to understand O'Connor's cultural context? For example, how important is it for readers to understand the racial dynamics that play in O'Connor's fiction, like Angela discussed earlier? Can O'Connor still resonate with readers, especially those reading in translation, which is a problem Fernanda brought up? Can O'Connor still resonate with readers who do not share an awareness of her region? And I know Mark kind of started going in that direction.
Well, this isn't exactly an answer to your question, but I wanted everyone to know that there is a biopic happening right now on Flannery O'Connor that Ethan Hawke is directing, and he co-wrote the script. His daughter Maya Hawke is starring as Flannery O'Connor in it. Laura Linney is playing Regina, Flannery's mother. Liam Neeson's playing a priest. Yeah, no, it's like a star-studded cast for sure. So it'll just be very interesting to see how, indeed, I mean, they obviously want it to have sort of international, let's go to Cannes, international power. And for the Hawks, anyway, I've been lucky enough to be a co-executive producer on it and got to be in some conversations over the script and thinking through, what was happening and watching father and daughter, Ethan and Maya, really interconnect on the power of Flannery O'Connor storytelling. And they both devoutly love Flannery, and they aren't Catholic. They love her craft. They love the prayer journal. They loved her relationship to spirit and conflict. So that, to me, answers a little bit of what you're asking. Yeah. So we'll see what the global reach is of it. But there's as much star power as possible to get into it. So we'll hope.
And everything she described was shot in Kentucky. So as documentarians, we went to Iowa. We went to Milledgeville. we went to Milledgeville a lot. Milledgeville. And so you really try to capture that local color, right? So everything, the biopic proved that you can explode the specific into the universal and shoot it in Kentucky, right? So that's, Flannery always reminds us of that. When you were speaking, Fernanda, about Flannery and also Angela, that she went to Mass and they were segregated. You know, she never went to a different kind of Mass. So I have a film coming out on Shakespeare's, the first ever mounting of Merchant of Venice in the Jewish ghetto. And when the actors, I shot everything for rehearsal and ideation. So when the actors were rehearsing and they got up and did a thing, and it was one of those actorly moments where, whoa, they took risk. And then they sat back down and discussed it. And they talked about the merchant, played by Reggie Cathay, who's African-American, hanging out on the Rialto with Shylock, who's Jewish. And they were talking about, it's like the South. And I immediately went to Flannery. It's like, it's in them, right? And that's what Mark meant. It's Flannery. Once you go through Flannery, she's always there, right? And that's probably why it is the specific of the region, but the lessons and the contemplation and the imagination is universal.
Yeah, to add on to that, I mean, O'Connor, one of the sources of her greatness is her ear. She has a brilliant ear for Southern idiom. The dialogue that she gives is so authentic, so pure, so absolutely convincing, that you are pulled into that world and you inhabit that space for as long as you're reading the story. It's just brilliant. So her stories are very local, and they need to be. Again, with Lynch, you know, it's through the finite, it's through the particular that we get the authenticity of the experience that's being described. And I could see why that would be very hard to do in Italian or in Spanish or in Portuguese or in any language other than the one that Flannery is writing in. And we all know that lots gets lost in the translation. So it's a particularly hard thing to do, I think, with O'Connor, to make it available to non-English speakers, non-English readers. However, O'Connor's greatness, and this echoes what Mark and Elizabeth and Ted were just saying, O'Connor's greatness is that these stories are large. They are like parables. I think it's very interesting that when O'Connor died, Thomas Burton compared her to Sophocles. He didn't compare her to another fiction writer, another story writer. It's like, no, she's like Sophocles because of these brilliant, dramatic falls from grace that we see happening. And just like Sophocles, of course, you need to know something about Greek culture in order to understand the play. If you're going to understand Shakespeare, you need to know something about Shakespearean culture if you're going to be able to read Hamlet or King Lear with any real understanding. Shakespeare's another one who doesn't translate well into other languages, right? You have to give every author his or her turf. And so yeah, it's going to take a little bit of work for people to get O'Connor, and they do have to know something about that time. You know, about the time of they need to know about Jim Crow. They need to know about this very particular, interesting, peculiar relationship between the races at the time that O'Connor is writing. But there's absolutely no doubt that she is able to go from the particular to the universal. You know, if you have a couple of tools that you can use in order to understand her.
I was going to say, our doc has shown in Spain, Sweden, Ireland, and I think Poland. So, you know, yes, in translation, I'm sure a lot was lost, but those countries, you know, purchased it and broadcast it.
Oh,
okay.
We're scheduled till 2:15.
No, we're scheduled to 2.
No, 2:15.
No problem. I have just. No, sorry. I have just 2 words. No, thanks. No, I just wanted to add that the problem for the Italian is really translation.
Oh, Fernanda, could you?
Oh, sorry. Always. Okay, that's okay. So I just 2 words to add to what has already been said, and this is still about the translation. I have just an example to present, and when the first time the stories, the short stories arrived in Italy, some titles has been maintained, some titles have been maintained, some titles have been changed. One of the short stories, the best short stories, whose title has been changed has been Punto Omega, which is the Italian translation from Everything That Rises Must Converge. And going around presenting my biography, I have noticed that when an Italian reader reads this story without knowing that the meaning of this story is going up, is this journey towards up, which is implied in the word rises, the Italian reader lost a lot of the meaning, because people always ask me why Punto Omega as a title. What does it mean? What does it connect this title to the story? If you are inside O'Connor's world, you can understand that this is a reference to Teilhard de Chardin stories. But if you don't know Flannery O'Connor or her South or her way of thinking, you don't know why this title. And the other greatest example is the displaced person, which in Italian has been translated as il profugo. And il profugo is, okay, a good translation, but it's not exactly the same meaning that Flannery O'Connor wanted in English with the word displaced, which is different from profugo. So when an Italian reader reads Flannery O'Connor thinking to a profugo, immediately he thinks about the central characters. He doesn't know, or he arrives at the end of the story to know that the displaced person is not only the central character, Mr. Gisak, but all the characters are displaced. And this is very difficult to understand for an Italian, because il profugo means someone male and someone coming from one nation to another nation, not displaced in the sense, in the general sense. So that's the problem that I usually find when speaking about Flannery O'Connor with other people, with people outside, I repeat, the academic world. However, I have to emphasize that these difficulties does not hinder readers, but help them to read and reread Flannery O'Connor's stories, so they can go deep and deep into her story, which is exactly what she wanted. Thanks.
I want to say one thing. When we did the Spanish, we took Flannery O'Connor to Spain, and we learned that there was a new translation coming out. In the old translation of Spain, they were using a different kind of slang language of the Andalus, a language of the south of Spain that most Madrianos and people in the north would consider really bad Spanish. So whenever it was an African American character, or when it was there was this real sense of two different languages. And they have a brand new translation now where they just said that's stupid, that's terrible, right? We shouldn't be doing this. So it's still the one Spanish language, and there's a lot of footnotes to say that this is how it would have been, you know, because there was a sense that you were kind of they were over stereotyping by using their own Spanish culture to kind of make a division that really wasn't there in Flannery O'Connor's writing. So anyway,
this is exactly what happens in Italy.
We have about 5 minutes. Does anyone have a question? Is there a mic at all? Oh, up here in the front, Joe, and then we'll do the back, and that'll probably be it.
Thanks, this is wonderful. You know, there are different types of Christian imaginations, and I think Marilyn Robinson, maybe to put the Presbyterian on the panel in the hot seat, said of O'Connor that her prose is beautiful, but her imagination appalls me. And O'Connor, I think, preemptively responded to that decades before when she wrote, I got a letter from an old lady in California who said that when the tired reader comes home at night, They want their heart to be lifted up. And I suppose that my work hadn't lifted up her heart. I should have responded that her heart would have been lifted up if it was in the right place.
Oh.
And I wondered if you could talk maybe about the different types of Christian imagination and what distinguishes hers as specifically Catholic from a writer like, say, Marilynne Robinson.
Well, that's a dissertation right there, you know? But I think they're a great comparison. And in terms of, you know, sort of my own reaction to Robinson's work too, which is, it's a kind of stridency. There's a sort of Protestant work ethic. There's this determination that seems distinctly Protestant to me, and in terms of her choice of language, in terms of the how dialogue is so distinct from the dialogue in O'Connor, and you know, mannerisms. Yeah, I don't know. They're both wonderful writers and Iowa connected. And they're both speaking to distinct regional and theological parts of our country. I mean, I love placing them together and seeing their differences, because that's what great literature is about, right? Is having room for, you know, the fact that they, whatever, dislike, or she does, you know, or we couldn't get an interview with her, fine, you know.
We tried. We stayed outside her office door for over an hour.
We did try to get an interview.
Just to get her to say what you just said. You know,
Yeah.
just to say that one line with her face, but she wouldn't do it, so.
We really wanted to, and the Presbyterian thing did not matter. Yeah, we couldn't get her, but anyway, I like comparing them, and I think there's room for both of them.
I think that O'Connor's, I go back to the aesthetic presumption that William says, dramatic movement. The Christian imagination of Marilynne Robinson is beautiful, but it's not like on a steam train getting somewhere, right? It's really kind of almost contemplative, and it's about memory and remembering. O'Connor is just not interested in that, and I think she's so taken by this movement, this transubstantiation. We got to move it, we have to change things in her characters. That's a different kind of, perhaps more Catholic, ritualistic kind of way of going through something, where I just don't see that in Marilynne Robinson's work.
Yeah, another quotation from Robinson when she was speaking about O'Connor, which kind of ticked me off a couple of years ago. I was writing an article that was reviewing Robinson's most recent book, whichever one it was. It was before Lila, or maybe it was when Lila came out. But she said, "I see very little grace in Flannery O'Connor." It's like, are you kidding me? There's grace in O'Connor constantly. So, but it obviously is a different kind. It's manifested in a very different way in Robinson. Robinson is sweet. Flannery's not sweet. Robinson's characters, you love all of them, even the bad guy, even Jack. Jack's a jerk, but you still love Jack. You don't really like any of O'Connor's characters. They're very prickly, difficult, real people. And as she says, I was just quoting this with Alice today, O'Connor says, to be a novelist, you live hotly in pursuit of the real. And the real for O'Connor were these weirdos that she lived among, herself included, right? All the freaks and folks. And that's her world. Those are the people that you write about. And what's so irritating about Robinson is, like, you have to give a writer her canvas, if we use a painting metaphor. You have to grant her world and judge the stories on whether or not they work within that world. And so there's something that obviously doesn't set well, and her critical acumen just completely goes out the window, you know, when she's thinking about O'Connor. So there is that. And I do have to say, I love Robinson. I think she's a brilliant, lovely writer. But there's sometimes when I'm reading it, there's something, I try to imagine O'Connor reading her and not finding it saccharine sometimes, you know. It's a kind of easy grace. I just, you know, earlier quoted it, even the mercy of the Lord burns in O'Connor's world. And, you know, she's just committed, you know, as Mark mentioned earlier, committed to this kind of conflict of these large forces coming together. O'Connor is cosmic in a way that I don't find Robinson. But yes, I agree. There's room for both of them. I don't think we have to choose. I think they're both beautiful writers in their different ways, but she's kind of blind, I think, to what's great about O'Connor.
And something about nature, how they both deal with nature and the coolness in Robinson's work as compared to what some might say, the melodrama of O'Connor's. So there's just something about how they both build their worlds and relate to nature that I find distinctly with Robinson, you know, both more Midwestern, a little Emersonian, and cooler, but beautiful. But you know, I maybe thinking cinematically as a filmmaker, I really like, and with O'Connor, we really tried to capture the landscape, her world, visually and sonically as we felt it while reading her fiction.
Let's end with the question in the back.
Thanks. The question actually leads on a bit from what you were just talking about. Elizabeth, I was really fascinated by what you were saying about your creative writing students in Rome, sort of feeling a bit almost alienated. And I wonder, is there something also in O'Connor about her Catholicism being a rural Catholicism as opposed to an urban Catholicism? And that there's a distinction there that kind of is helpful, especially for, you know, students and, you know, people who kind of practice Catholicism in a really different space than the city allows, and which sort of links her a bit to Robinson as well, and maybe someone like Shirley Jackson too.
And I would remind the panel you had 3 minutes to answer before Martin Scorsese comes.
Just really quickly, it's a Southern Catholicism, and O'Connor, it's always good to remember that O'Connor is displaced, like her displaced person, in the sense that most Catholics live in the Northeast. You know, I grew up in the Northeast. I was surrounded by Catholics my whole life. I didn't think being Catholic was special. Then I went to graduate school in the South, and it's like, there's nobody Catholic here. So when you went to Mass, it was like being with Jesus in the upper room. There were 12 people. And I thought, oh, this is what it was like to be O'Connor, where you don't have Catholics all around you. So her Catholicism is inevitably going to be colored by the evangelical Protestantism and the extremes of that she's living in the midst of. And that's part of, I think, what makes her Catholic. There's many different forms of the Catholic imagination as there are Catholic writers. And I think one of the things that makes hers particular and special is that she lives in the South and that she has absorbed some of this kind of evangelical furor, flavor, energy that is part of her Catholic vision.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't really have too much to add, but I think that you bring up a really good point about rural spaces. Of course, a couple of O'Connor's stories take place, you know, in cities, but very, very few. And perhaps that is part of the sort of disconnect, but also a way of entering into a world that's so different, right? Because it is rural, and perhaps reading O'Connor in today's particularly fraught moment in history, as well as in an urban space, as most college students end up being, at least if they're in Rome, definitely is going to pull them into the story in a very different way. And it's going to be more visceral, I think, and tactile, right? Because I think we all have, especially post-COVID, we all have a craving for the rural, you know, for the landscape. And it's something that O'Connor does beautifully with beautiful simplicity. Yeah.
Just one note on I think that's also there's a temporal difference that's been well written about forever, but the experiential side of time, I think Mike mentioned a couple of days ago about the different kinds of time of kairos or chronos, right, in that direction, and she would have been aware of that, and I think she's working that because the dialectic is there, and so when you factor those two things together, because you know I'm from a small town in Ohio, that dialectic it can take its time, it can masquerade as not much is happening yet, right, and then the last thing is what you were saying, that because of the dialectic, it lands in the reader, and that's what I think really what Mark said about writing towards parable is that intersection with poetry, right? It is the thing, and it lands when we read, right? Or perform, because Flannery's being performed around the world, and that's interesting to see it intersect with cultures. So.
Well, thank you so much for all that wonderful expertise. Can we give a round of applause, please?